So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, David Rainey, is Washington Bureau Chief at The Economist. David?
Thank you very much. And everyone has their cell phones off after lunch, please. So we have a very distinguished panel for a very important subject because it touches not just on the whole of immigration policy, but on the kind of the deep historic roots of the compact that sort of stable, non-war-torn nations have made with the tough places in the world, going back to World War II, and yet we've seen it's politically not an easy sell. And these are people who are involved day to day, not just at the high level of policy, but also welcoming refugees to this country, helping them settle, but also, because each of them is a leader in their own communities, sometimes faith communities, making the case to their own American communities that this is the right thing to do. And that's not an easy case to make, clearly, nowadays. So we're very honored to have, in order here, we have Joanne Lyon, Ambassador and General Superintendent Emerita from the Wesleyan Church. We have Scott Arbeiter, President of World Relief. And we have Bishop Mario Eduardo Dorsenville Rodriguez of the Archdiocese of Washington. So we have really some of the most important players in refugee resettlement in the US. And I wanted to start off by asking each of you one question, but I'm very keen to make this kind of lively panel, so please do jump in. So Scott, tell us about the kind of the facts and figures of refugees, and perhaps explain to the audience that sometimes, you know, the media even, or the public, uses these terms a bit interchangeably between an economic migrant coming for a better life, someone who is a refugee, someone who's an asylum seeker. Refugees, it's a very specific legal term that carries certain legal obligations on a country like the US. So tell us, first of all, what's a refugee? And your organization, how does it work with the American government to resettle refugees? And just give us a sense of the picture now, perhaps in the last year, how many have been resettled by your organization in the US? Just kind of set the scene for us.
That's a lot of territory, and I could go on for that for a long time, so I will trust my friends to pull me back when they need to. You're exactly right, David. There's a conflation of the definition of immigrant and asylum seeker and refugee, and most people that are in getting the news from the popular culture are understandably confused because those terms are thrown around in such a way that often you can't distinguish between them. There are people who come to the United States for economic opportunity. There are people who come in that are documented, people who come in are undocumented. There are asylum seekers, but the refugee status is a unique status. And you asked me to give a sense for the scale of the issue. If you think about right now, there are 65 million displaced people in the world, greater than the world has known. Now, 65 million is a difficult number to get your arms around. When I talk in my home area, the Midwest, I can say to people there, imagine if you're in Chicago and you're driving home from a conference, and every home, every apartment building, every condominium is empty in the entire city of Chicago. But then expand that to all of Illinois. But then add all of Minneapolis and Minnesota, and all of Detroit and Michigan, and all of Milwaukee and Wisconsin. You could take 6 Midwestern states, and then to bring it home, add the entire population of Maryland, the entire population of Virginia, and you would still have room for 5 million more before you get to this number of how many people are displaced. It is of epic and tragic proportion. Now, of those 65 million, 22.5 million have the legal designation as a refugee, meaning that they have been moved out of their country, and because of persecution, because of danger, they are not able to return either to their home or to their home country, and so they are extremely vulnerable. Of the 65 million displaced, which, by the way, is too tame of a word. Displaced is like somebody just got, lost. They've had everything ripped away from them. Every bit of stability has been taken from them, but the 22.5 million refugees are the most vulnerable of them. The US government has, on a bipartisan basis, with the US Refugee Admittance Program, since 1980 had a historic posture that it was in the U.S. government's moral obligation and best national security and economic interests to have a welcoming presence for refugees. Historically, we have resettled over 3 million refugees since that program began. Our average is about 94,000 per year. The current refugee resettlement admittance is expected in 2018 to be 45,000. So that means in a time of the greatest displacement of human beings the world has known, incredible vulnerability, the US response has actually shrunk quite considerably. And that impacts, above all else, the vulnerable refugee. But in addition to that, it impacts our own culture and our own society because our own moral fiber is weakened, I believe, by the fact that we have turned aside, in many cases, a blind eye to these most vulnerable people. I'll offer one last comment on this because you talked about World Relief. We're a faith-based organization. And
what faith?
Pardon me?
What denomination are you sort of linked to?
Interdenominational, really. It's a Christian organization.
So Protestant, broadly Protestant?
Broadly Protestant, although we partner well with our brothers and sisters in the Catholic Church because we share our this common set of values about the image of God being resident in every woman, man, girl, and boy, and our job is to help burnish that image. But one of the things that we look to always is Jesus made some very clear statements. Whatsoever you do for one of the least of these, that you've done to me. He said, do to others what you would have done for you. And I love the picture that we get in the Gospels because Jesus always had this mindset. He took the people that were in the center of the picture, the people of power, the people of influence, and he always tended to move them to the margins. And the people who are on the margins of the picture, the poor, the vulnerable, were the ones he moved into the center of the picture. And we feel it's our calling to do that. And historically, our nation has accepted that calling. But we've become prodigal to that calling in this season. I'll stop there for the moment.
Thank you very much. So, Bishop, yes. The Catholic Church, I think, is perceived as sort of pro-immigration in general. You've had even some figures within the kind of the Trump administration accusing the Catholic Church of being, in the business of filling pews with kind of new customers, as if it's a kind of marketing pitch. But we're focusing this not just on immigrants, but on refugees. What's the position of the Catholic Church in America towards refugees? And with your own flock, is there an absolute consensus that this is their Christian duty to welcome refugees to this country? Or do you have people who consider themselves Catholics in good standing, full of Christian charity, who'll say, why look after them here? Why shouldn't we look after them somewhere else? Why do they have to come to America? We can't, let everyone into America. Tell me about the debate within the Catholic Church and how you interact with your own flock.
Perfect. Yes, I guess that I will begin by quoting what the principles of the Catholic teaching, the social Catholic teaching, are for the Conference of Bishops and for the whole Church, not only in the United States, but around the world. Is that everyone knows that we are advocating always for the dignity of the human person. And under that premise, it would be so important always to contemplate the right of people to move, to walk, to get away from danger. Because guess what? If you see the terrible experience that we have seen through these days on television with the massacre that we were witnessing, what's the main instinct of a person when he's in danger? They try to flee, just to go away from danger. That's what happens with many of our people who are refugees. They're just trying to save their lives, try to get a sense of peace, and to try to find a way to develop their existence in a peaceful place. And that's a very important point for humanity, is understanding why they are moving. And the move is important. I guess that's inspired also in the Bible and the gospel that we preach every day. And I guess that in a Christian country like ours, I really think that it's much better and much easier to understand that what we do is not only out of altruistic feelings, but it's conviction in the heart that we really need to be the presence of God in the life of those who are in need. And that's what, for 50 years, inspired in 2,000 years record, the conference have done in the United States. Therefore, when we speak about the human drama, I really think that there is a phenomenon right now which is called Francisco, and they say, well, Pope Francis is just doing something new. No, he's retaking what has been for 100 years in the middle of the church. Open your arms. Don't be afraid of the stranger. Recall that those who really love and recognize the importance of the human person always are blessed. And I guess that that's a very important point, that it moves that engine that is called USCCB, United States Conference of Bishops. We don't think about ourselves. We speak about on behalf of 63 million people who believe, who worship, who comes to our parishes, who open their arms, religious sisters, religious communities, priests, deacons, ladies, volunteers, Catholic charities, clinic. A lot of people are right there producing something which is how we're going to move from a culture of indifference to a culture of solidarity. How we're going to say, yes, we really want to recognize in these people Jesus' face. And I really think when you put the spiritual component, everything comes easier to understand in the drama we are dealing with in this last time or that last decade. I am extremely moved by your data. And I know, yes, the problem is getting worse and worse. And I think that when we know that the kitchen is in fire, we just can't go to the second floor of the house to sleep quietly. Nothing is going to happen to us. Sooner or later, that fire is going to get us. Therefore, better to say, yes, we are aware and we're just trying to be proactive rather than reactive. And I really think that that's a very important role of the conference and the church, the Catholic Church here in this country.
Thank you, Bishop. So, Ambassador Lyon, we're going to come back to some of these kind of questions of the moral case for refugees. But there is also, quite often, an economic case made. And there are, I think your denomination is active in places like upstate New York, where you have towns and cities which lost a lot of industry during the kind of, you know, the de-industrialization of the Northeast. Towns like, I think, Utica, Watertown, these are places where you have seen a case being made for, you know, actually refugees revitalize communities. Tell us how that works. And I think you said Wesleyan denomination actually has some experience in exactly that kind of field.
Yes, that's exactly right. In fact, we have a college called Houghton College, which is south of Buffalo, between Buffalo and Rochester. And that college has taken on putting in campuses in Houghton, in Buffalo, and also in Utica, focused completely on refugees that are in that area to begin to have them educated and lift them up. And I love the statement that the director of this program has said. He said, you know, Buffalo was built on immigrants. Buffalo was built on Italians, on Polish, and now the new Buffalo is going to be built on Burmese and Congolese, and he named all the people that were in the college at that time. I thought, what a great vision. I mean, that's exactly what it should be. And so as local churches in that area, we have been very welcoming with refugees. And what Scott mentioned about World Relief and also with the Catholic Church and Catholic Relief Services, we in local churches work together with that. And I think one of the things that happens regarding refugees that is never quantified, no one has looked at this, so some of you researchers out there, please do some research on this. And that is that when Catholic Relief Services, World Relief and the others, and the government sort of have finished the money that's there, local churches come alongside and continue to work with refugees and continue to help them become integrated into the community. And I think that has made the difference that we have in the United States of refugees being integrated into the larger community as opposed to the ghettoizing that we have in Europe. And I really want to say it's been the faith community that has really done that. I was just with someone not long ago in the South where that local church had 13 families that sold their homes in the suburbs and moved in and bought homes and lived among the new refugees coming into that city. So this is huge. And you know, we don't see this in the news. No one talks about this. But the faith community is doing enormous things in that. And I want to also mention about what you said, Bishop, regarding the house on fire in the first floor and the second floor. I was just recently on a panel someplace else. And so someone who was a bit against the whole refugee piece said, well, they should just stay in their own country. That's where they're the most satisfied. And I thought, I mean, my mind immediately went to pictures of Syria. I mean, no one in Syria wants to leave Syria. Originally, that's home. But you can't live in that. And to think that we would, on this side in the United States, the most prosperous, wealthiest, powerful country in the world, would say, well, you just stay there and watch your kids get raped and everything bombed and everything else, because that's your home and that's where you need to be.
But so I'm the working journalist on this panel, and it's my kind of job to be kind of tough.
Yeah.
So every one of your arguments about the mandates of faith, that kind of deep sense that this is a Christian duty, an American duty, that these are people who will revitalize communities, that faith organizations are getting together and helping rehouse the next citizens. I've heard all of those arguments made in places very close to Utica, Buffalo, where they're admitting Syrian refugees, sponsoring families, the churches and the communities working together. Those arguments were all being made when I went in Canada, on the Canadian side of the St. Lawrence River. You travel 2 miles across the water to Watertown, New York, or some of these other cities, and they're not in any mood to let any Syrians in at all, because the word we have not mentioned is terrorism. So even if the churches want to do the Canadian-style welcoming, their flocks, Catholic priests have told me this in upstate New York. They don't want any Muslims anywhere near the US. They think they are, there is no way of screening them. There's no way of keeping them safe. Why would you let them in? And so there is, your talk about how the moral imperative makes it easy. The truth is it's not easy right now, is it? The debate in this country's just elected a president who promised to limit refugees. And that was pretty popular. And he's now capping refugees. So let me ask you how that works, how that interconnects with your arguments. Because I think we have to have a kind of a dose of reality about the situation right now in the US.
David, it's a great and it's a fair question, because you live in a dangerous world, and there are people who really want to do us harm. And the question I think that we're being asked as Americans is to become polarized, that you're either pro-security or pro-refugee. And we believe you can be both. And let me give you a couple of reasons why I believe that. I mentioned that there have been 3 million refugees resettled in the US since the program began. There has not been one US citizen killed in a terrorist-inspired act by a refugee. The Cato Institute recently did a study, and they said that the chances of an individual American being killed in a terrorist attack sponsored by a refugee was 1 in 3.64 billion to 1. That would mean that your chances of being killed in a terrorist attack sponsored by a refugee are about the same on your ride home tonight as winning the lottery and getting killed by a stray golf ball at the same time. So, do we live in a dangerous world? We clearly do. But part of the reason that the executive order met as much difficulty in the courts as it did was the courts were saying you have not demonstrated, Justice Department, that the security risk that you claim actually exists. And we should be very vigilant on our security. And I know World Relief, and I suspect our friends on either side, we went to the administration right away and said, security and vetting matters, and we're prepared to do everything we can to help improve the system wherever it needs improving. But the real improvements of the systems are not first in security. They're actually in what happens after that in the integration of the refugees for the benefit of everyone, the security record is extraordinarily solid. We shouldn't let up on our guard. But you can't make the case against refugees on the facts of security.
And let me ask other members of the panel, is there a sense that actually, if you're trying to make that case to your flocks, you know, you have to get pretty pragmatic. Instead of making a pure moral argument about kind of kindness and compassion, you need to say, as The Economist magazine has said, if you were a would-be terrorist, coming through the refugee route would be a really stupid route to choose, because you're going to be vetted
That's right.
in a way that, you know, if you're ISIS, you're going to send someone with a European passport who doesn't need a visa. I mean, that's, is there an argument, while you're making your moral case, for actually getting quite political in this moment and making that kind of very pragmatic, kind of concrete case about the security risks? How do you...
Yes, very definitely. In the local church, people sitting in the pew, they hear the news just like we do. They hear the fear-mongering. They hear all of this. And so we are constantly trying to restate this in this term. I mean, we try to make the moral argument, but sorry to say, sometimes the moral argument isn't the top one there. And although we like to think it is, but reality. So we make that moral argument. We have to make, though, the other argument that we've just said and that Scott so wonderfully explained is that this is the reality of what it is. And just keep saying that. We have to keep saying that because people are inundated with all of this and the fear that is so heavy right now.
And Bishop, how does
Yes, I would add to what Scott and Joanne are saying something very, very important for all of us to consider as well. Yesterday I got a call from a family. Their mother was pretty ill for almost 3 years. And essentially, those who took care of her through 3 years, most of them were immigrants and refugees. And when you experience what's the real impact of refugees in the life of the country, and you see so many millions who have done quietly such a beautiful work, and I'm just speaking about 10 years of working with refugees and immigrants, and I'm sure that many of you have done it. What's the experience? It is the experience of the gratitude in their face. That is so rewarding because that person is not going to pay you. It's someone else, perhaps our Lord, the one who is going to reward you. Therefore, when you just come to that point, is when you say, this is not the wrong side of the terrorism or the gang or whatever it might be that we keep hearing in the news, but this is such a great way. For instance, many of you are in hotels now. How many of these hotels are cleaned by refugees or immigrants?
That's right.
Or who prepared the lunch we just ate? Therefore, I really think that the component of immigrants and refugees are so immersed into our structure that denying them, it would be in so many ways denying our parents, grandparents, and even think about who's going to take care of us when we just can't. I really think that is the question that we have to place in our minds, because when we are so scared of security, security comes to a point which is egocentrism, me. But we know that this world, more than me, needs you. Because when I am able to break up the selfish approach that many human beings may have in life, is when the time of real human development begins in the existence of those who believe.
Scott, can I ask, World Relief has a very kind of global kind of view of the situation. I have heard kind of conservative grassroots voters who are very angry about refugees say that America lets in far more refugees than its fair share, spends far more on refugees. Is that right globally, your number of 65 million refugees? Where are most of them actually given haven, and how does America compare in terms of letting people in and financial effort? What's the real situation?
I want to come back, if I can, for a moment, to the security question you asked a moment
Please.
ago, and then I'll come to that. One thing about security, both here and then on the other side, the confusion that often happens for Americans watching the news is they think that refugees have a choice to come to the United States. The reality is no refugee can choose the United States.
Yeah.
They can't raise their hand and say, I'm in a refugee camp, I'd like to go to Tucson, Arizona. The only way a refugee can make their way to the US is if the State Department chooses them, then puts them through 18 to 24 months of vetting, including biometric scans, interviews by the FBI, by Homeland Security, and at any point, if they have any questions, they can refuse them admittance. So the only refugees that come are those that are selected by the US government and vetted appropriately. Many Americans look at the number of refugees coming onto the shores of Europe and naturally think that's a security threat. It is. It's not the US experience. So we have to be careful to separate those two.
Within that, very quickly, how big a blow to your cause was it when you had the congressional testimony last year, I guess, when the FBI director said, or the director of Homeland Security, that you couldn't actually vet what was happening with refugees in Syria, which I have had quoted to me, more times than I can count on, political rallies.
That was FBI Director Comey.
That's right.
Who had said that. And it was a very unique and distinct context that he was talking about. He wasn't talking about the whole program. There are places where you do not have adequate records.
Syria.
Yes, and there are places where you cannot get adequate records. But again, the US State Department reserves the right at any point, if it feels that the records point to a problematic past or insufficient, they can simply say, we're not bringing that person in. That was used as a shield to discount the rest of the program. The other part of the security piece overseas is that what we fail to recognize is that our position of America first, thinking that keeping refugees out makes us safer, can really backfire on us. Because we do work in many countries with Muslim majorities, and the narrative that is now being used by ISIS as a recruiting tool is, see, we told you the Americans hated Muslims all along, and now they have proven it. And so what we are finding is that work that we've been doing in Muslim communities, where we've been doing peace building work, has actually been set back many years because of a US policy that is actually inflaming the anti-American sentiment. And if there was a desire before to cause harm, it's even greater now. Now, you asked another question. I think
anyone from the panel can take it. Just is America an unusually generous receiver of refugees, or actually most refugees, being given haven much closer to their origin country? How does that work?
And Scott can give the exact numbers, but I have to look at Lebanon and Jordan. That literally the refugees that they have now, I believe in Lebanon at this time, is greater than their own population. And so we're looking at these two countries close by Syria that are literally, I mean, their weight is very heavy of the refugees that they have in their country right now. So when I look at that, and I look at our country, and I look at the numbers that we have capped on refugees, and what you've just said regarding all the vetting that takes place, I feel embarrassed, frankly. Maybe that isn't a strong enough word. I'm really perplexed with what we have and what we could offer, and how refugees, their lives they could flourish, and what could happen, and then how they could even make us in America flourish, and our country, and what they have to give. So it's our loss. All the way through, it's our loss.
And numbers are reflected upon statistical reports from 100,000 refugees that we used to reset. Now it's 50,000, and the obligation for Catholic Charities to make the cuts. And I'm sure that many of the institutions that do this work is terrible. Therefore, right now, yes, we have been harmed in some
I would like
way.
Oh,
please, Joanne.
Well, I just was going to say also, what we haven't talked about is how much it cost us. I was also recently in a debate regarding this, how much it costs to resettle a refugee, but they forgot to add how much refugees give back many times over. on the cost of what it costs to resettle a refugee here in our country. So we have to look at that, both sides of the equation.
That tees up beautifully my next kind of question to the whole panel. We're very lucky to have a panel of people who, you don't just have kind of broad philosophical views of how refugees should be resettled. You do the nitty-gritty. Now, America is a bit unusual in the way that the American system gives people the right to work very quickly, but doesn't give people a lot of welfare benefits. They run out pretty quickly, and they actually have to repay the loan that they get for their airfare to the US, whereas the European model is often the opposite, that you get welfare payments but not the right to work. It's that American model where you have people, they're given a little bit of help when they first arrive, an apartment sometimes for a few months, 3 months I think it is, some health care for a very short space of time, but basically the big gift that America gives refugees is the right to work very, very quickly. How does that work? Does that work well? Is that as a distinctive American approach? How does that work generally, and how is that working kind of right now into 2017?
Just by contrast for a moment, and it really goes to your prior question and tying it to this one, just by comparison, Canada will resettle the same number of refugees as the US, having 1/10 of our population. So when the storyline is that the United States settles more than anyone else at a numeric basis, that has historically been true. But last year we were actually number 4. And with 45,000 in 2018, we'll be number 9. So we're eroding that base. As you mentioned, David, there are different systems in place for how it takes place for people to become self-sufficient. The average refugee, 80% of the refugees on average are self-sufficient within 6 months. Now, can you imagine coming into a place where you don't know the language, all the skills that you had in your prior home are now discounted dramatically because you can't even communicate that you have those skills. And yet 80%, because they're an extremely resilient population and a very entrepreneurial population, 80% are employed within 6 months. And a big part of that is because the churches have got people out helping them gain skills in the marketplace. And there was a recent study just done that said over the 10-year period from 2004 to 2015, the refugee population contributed massively more in taxes over those years than they received in benefits. So it was a net uptake in terms of its impact on the US economy. There are many people in this audience who have a business background. This is where they have a real potential to step into this, because if you take a look at where the real needs are for the improvement of the refugee resettlement program, yes, let's pay attention to security, but it's really in the integration. The match grant programs that provide training for the less skilled or skills that didn't transfer is an incredible public-private partnership, $2 public to $1 private, which gets people more quickly independent. Businesses can hire high-skilled laborers if they will help them with language and licensing, and they will have incredible assets on their staff for many years to come. And so there are many ways that we can invest even further, but without that, we still have a very good record.
Yes, I guess that for our experience, Catholic Charities around the country has such a great partners and agencies who are instrumental to get these people, to train these people, to hire these people. And basically, in what refers here in the Archdiocese of Washington, the rate of perseverance for training classes and everything that we offer to refugees, the retention rate is 99%. Therefore, that means that the one who comes here comes to learn, they want to get the skills, and they really want to work. And constantly, many agencies, many firms are just calling us, do you have some people to send us? Therefore, I'm speaking about shopping centers, food markets, hotels. Everyone is just very well connected with the structure. Therefore, I really think that they're welcome.
I just wanted to add something. I mentioned about the college in New York that's offering 2-year degrees, et cetera. But also in our broader church community, many of our universities are sponsoring refugee families. And that is a very interesting dynamic because it covers all kinds of, it integrates the families in with the university students and the faculty and all of this. So that's as well as the local churches, but universities Christian universities are doing this as well.
So panel, I do want to keep, I feel I need to keep this to the panel honest because, you know, we're in a country which is very divided by the question of refugees.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
exactly.
And so if everything we discuss is the reasons why everyone agrees that refugee policy is kind of good and a benefit, we're ignoring that roughly half of the country, which takes a very, very different view. Another thing that's striking about the debate in America, not just that giving people the right to work early, is how very localized it often is. Instead of these kind of big national kind of schemes where you see, you know, Angela Merkel kind of identified with admitting 1 million refugees, it's very striking when I've covered this in America how you'll have individual city mayors. So the former mayor of Baltimore sort of said publicly that they had all this empty housing, they wanted refugees in Baltimore, it was a good thing. You can see it's not even perfectly red state, blue state. So I went to Twin Falls, Idaho, where they've had a lot of refugees. They had an attempt to have a public referendum against refugees in Twin Falls, Idaho, but Idaho takes historically a lot of refugees, very red state. But then another red state, South Carolina, last year was full of stories of communities having very angry town hall meetings, up in arms at the idea of communities being designated as refugee resettlement centers. What makes a community welcome refugees? Because it's clearly not perfectly red state, blue state, because Idaho is more welcoming than South Carolina, but they're both very red. How does that American model of city mayors and local communities having their own very kind of long, close relationship with refugee resettlement, how does that work? So it's a very distinctive American approach to have these long, historic kind of ties between refugee resettlement agencies like yours and individual cities. How does that work, and how, does that point to any lessons as to how to navigate this very divided moment in refugee policy?
David, I think it's in some large part a matter of leadership of public sentiment. The first panel this morning, I think, made a very compelling case that the border has been secure for the last decade, and that the number of illegal entries across the border had been reduced by, depending on which measure you use, 75 to 90%. That's not the narrative that's out there. So as a result, very well-intentioned, well-meaning people who otherwise might be compassionate about an issue are operating on a set of data that is moving them towards fear when in fact it's not credible. Now, are there issues about border security that we should be concerned about? Certainly we'll pay attention to that, but it's not the case that's being made. I think the same is true with regard to refugees. So in the cities, let me take, for example, outside of Chicago proper, the Wheaton area, a very conservative area, an area with a lot of historic conservative evangelicals who in large part—
Wheaton College, the most famous evangelical college.
Many of those evangelicals reportedly, and I think accurately so, 80% plus voted for President Trump. So you might assume that at least many of them would be sympathetic to his points of view. But in Wheaton, what we find, because there's been a long-term historic resettlement effort there, and business leaders and church leaders and community leaders have come to know these refugees for the beauty and the dignity that they bring, it changes the narrative. So I think part of the reason you see very polarized pockets, it depends on whether or not they have a personal experience with the humanity, the dignity of the refugee population, and whether or not city leadership is prepared to stand up and make the case for that. So I do think a lot of it has to do with education. A lot of it has to do with introduction. We have, in our circles, as we introduce people in the community, we've had people come to us and complain loudly, "You've settled a refugee in my neighborhood, and I'm very angry about it." And we've had the experience of saying, first of all, you want to honor that because it's an honest emotion, and you want to respect where it came from. But then you ask, would you be willing to meet the refugee family? Would you be willing to enter into a dialogue at a human level? And we have seen that as that takes place, the barriers fall, and friendships are formed. And now in Wheaton last year, that area, there were a great number of people who in the middle of the discussion of this, they made their own signs, they were putting them in the front lawns. We are not afraid. We welcome refugees.
I was going to add to that too, David, is the personal relationship, is knowing a person who's a refugee and suddenly, and I think that's the real piece that we have to, rather than this title, refugees, and then all kinds of things come to one's mind. It is people with names, with families who care about their families. We've done the same thing throughout our church regarding immigration, and we've stopped talking about immigration issues. We are saying immigrants are people. And so the statement we have across the country, we have immigrant connections in many of our churches across the country, and these are centers that have been approved by the Bureau of Immigration Appeals. So people have been trained, so they're working out of our churches with immigrants. And instead of calling it an immigration center, we've called it immigrant connections. So it moves it from the issue to the person. And I think that's what we have to do regarding refugees as well, is the people and the personal relationships. And it'll have to get to that. And then that takes away the fear of everything else.
And Bishop, how does that work in the Catholic Church's experience here in America? Because there are very Catholic communities which are welcoming to refugees, and there's Catholic communities, I could cite upstate New York, which is full of Catholics, very opposed.
I might be able to share a story from a parish that I was working with for 7 years. There was at the beginning kind of tensions between both communities. You can see that across many parishes around the country. And yes, the Anglo part with the Hispanic and the Hispanic, they were clashing constantly. And we decided to organize, and that favors totally what you're saying, conversation tables. People, even with interpreters, because there was always the barrier sometimes for language. They began to get to know their faces, their histories, where they were coming from, what was the trajectory, the whole thing. And little by little, through months, I would say 1 to 2 years, we just began to see that the sense of unity, understanding, when they began to call themselves by names and they were identifying the children, that really was a great point, because they were moving from stereotypes, preconceived ideas. Perhaps the big problem that we have in this society of ours is that people really have just one center of information with television, and we sit down in front of the television and we try to get all the information we have to do. However, if we go away from this news that they are sometimes informing us and making stereotypes in our minds, and we go and have what we call encounter, human encounter, that really transformed everything we thought.
And you use the word encounters, you use the word education. What kind of voices, to offer kind of practical experience to the audience in a community where there is a loud debate about resettling refugees, who are the community leaders that you think have a kind of credibility? Is it kind of police chiefs talking about crime levels not changing? Is it school districts talking about how much it does or does not cost the school district to have refugees? If you were assembling a kind of a town hall meeting in an angry town and you wanted a panel of people on the sort of top table to make the case for the work that you're doing, who are the right people to put on that table?
If
Please.
you allow me, everyone. Everyone.
That's a big table.
I really think that it's not just one sector. If you really have the leadership, the spiritual leadership, the school leadership, the political leadership together, I really think that is consensus. I would never say, no, you are not important for this conversation. Everyone has to show up.
And I think the thing I would add to that is the spirit of the conversation is critical, because the risk is in this, that we set this up as good guys and bad guys. And that immediately we're polarized to think that anybody disagrees with my point of view, I can so quickly, because I can feed myself whatever media I want, we can serve ourselves a toxic stew of one-dimensional thinking, and we can dehumanize people who are fine human beings because they disagree with us. So I can minimize their intellect, their humanity, their motives, and shame on me when I do that. So I think in addition to getting everyone there, it's a matter of creating a dialogue where say, can we actually have a conversation? And can we hear each other's voices here? And that's a really difficult thing to do in this pitched environment. But that's what we've had success doing in the peace building work we're doing overseas in the communities where tribal warfare has been there for generations. It's a matter of deconstructing that polarized narrative and learning how to talk to each other in such a way that we acknowledge each other's humanities and our fears and concerns, and we constructively do something together.
Just before we go to Q&As, and I don't want to interrupt you, had a point on that, but I don't want to finish without asking you, what are the concrete realities of the new policies that are coming out of the Trump administration? Is that changing the way that you are working right now? Are you having to stop doing some things that you were hoping to do or planning to do? Are you having to do new things that you weren't planning to do? And then we're going to go to the audience Q&As.
Well, I guess I would like to tag on to that last one, and then I can say something, and then I think Scott needs to speak to this. But I just think, I'm thinking of communities where I've worked in the past, I mean here, dealing with various issues. And it's bringing together the influencers of the community. Who are the major influencers in the community? And then out of that, really casting a vision and an imagination of what our community would really look like with refugees and how our community would be enhanced with that. And I think that's where this would then ultimately come out to help people to begin to imagine new things. But regarding the Trump administration policies that have come out, it impacts us as far as numbers of refugees because we work with both of these groups in our local churches. So I'll let them speak to that. I mean, it doesn't mean that we want to do less work, but if we have less refugees, we're doing less work in that way. However, I do know this was prior to President Trump being elected. There was a governor that had said he was taking no Syrian refugees into the state, and the Archbishop of that particular diocese came to the governor and said, we, in a sense, operate under another authority, and said, we will take Syrian refugees. So hats off to the Archbishop.
I'm very keen to leave lots of time for questions from the audience, but do you want to tell us about something concrete that is changing in your work as a result of the latest kind of caps and regulations?
When you have a reduction of 110,000 goal, and we didn't achieve 110,000 to 50,000, it changes the footprint. And so you have to adjust to that. And so we, at World Relief, we had 26 U.S. offices. We needed to close 4 offices. And we had to reduce staff commensurate to that. And that meant that people who were really committed as a mission and as a ministry had given their lives to that, they lost both their ministry and their livelihood in it. But, you know, World Relief doesn't have some great right to exist. It's not as though we are the center of the universe. We want to serve however many refugees the U.S. government brings in. We think, you know, the president has said, let's make America great. We really believe America has the potential to be great in a way that almost no other country does. We're not great if we don't protect our borders. We're also not great if we don't have compassion. And we really believe the president could lead us in a way where we could have an appropriate balance between compassion, and security that would cause the world to step back and wonder. So we had to adjust our footprint. But we really hope what will happen is that the administration will come to see the value of the refugee population. They will do the work on the vetting processes that they feel is necessary, and that we'll see ourselves responding back in a way that's commensurate to the crisis.
So Bishop, very, very briefly.
Yes,
I'm going to go to
very briefly. I guess that it has brought challenges, yes, indeed. But as men of faith, I guess that join my brother bishops, challenges always are opportunities. And the great thing is that perhaps that challenge has brought us something that we never thought before, and it is that the nation doesn't think only as Washington, New York, or LA think. And that's a real challenge, which brings a wonderful opportunity to spread the good news.
Thank you. So I think the audience, you're old hands at this now. There are note cards on your table. So if you could fill out a question that you have, once you've filled it out, if you could hold it up, staff will come and pick them up. And in the meantime, we have a polling question, our next polling question. And I'm told that there are instructions on your table. And the new question is that they're giving you 4 choices as to why refugees should be welcomed to the United States. So the starting point is, if you're making the case that refugees should be welcomed to the United States, this is because, and then they're giving you 4 options. So option A is that, and I'll read these twice, they've undergone multiple security screenings, option A. Option B is entrepreneurs, they are a net benefit to communities. C, they are fleeing violence or persecution. And D, they help to re-energize communities and industries. So one more time, the reason that you would give to welcome refugees, if you want to welcome them, is A, they've undergone multiple security screenings. B, as entrepreneurs, they're a net benefit to communities. C, they are fleeing violence or persecution. Or D, they help to re-energize communities and industries. Ah, they're actually up on the screen. There you go. Look at that.
Mm.
So, we have okay, it's great writing, but it's not easy writing. It's elegant. Okay, I'm going to come back to that one. So the question for panel is, do you see young people in America and around the world as a source of hope if you want to see a more humane approach to refugees? Are young people more accepting, less prejudiced, and less fearful? That's the question from the audience. So jump in on that.
Well, I would say yes. I do spend quite a bit of time on university campuses, and that's what I find among young people these days. So I'm hopeful.
Yeah, I think our young people are growing up in a global and connected world. So their sense of boundary and distance and exclusion is diminished because they understand that they have much more in common with the people that are on the other sides of the world than they have indifference to them.
Working with young professionals here in DC, I can see that their openness to work on social justice issues is huge. I really think that young people really want to help others.
Here's a very interesting question about the role of social media. So you've talked about misinformation, you've talked about the need to kind of educate and push back. We haven't really touched on the fact, which again as a working reporter I can vouch for, that when people tell me that there are secret kind of plane loads of Muslim terrorists being flown in to the south of the country by President Obama, this was last year, you ask people, where did you see that, or where did you hear that, and they say, well, it's on Facebook. So these are around. Is that an area where you have, either as churches or as organizations, tried to push back, or do you think it's where you can and should push back? Tell us about the role of social media in terms of shaping the debate that people have about refugees.
I would say that probably none of us who are in the resettlement agencies have sufficient resources to change the entire public narrative. I mean, the notion that the Russians were meddling in the election, there are great resources put into trying to disprove that, but how would you counter that kind of other state with just small resettlement agencies? The real power in our voice is in the power of the volunteer base that we have, the power of the people that you mentioned, David, the police chiefs, the spiritual leaders, et cetera. The real power will not be because we catalyzed it, other than perhaps calling people to the point of view. It's the many hundreds and hundreds of thousands who begin to get their message out.
I guess that we are just in a constant, living in a constant information. It's like a world of messages. And most of the time when I'm speaking about young people, I said it's important to listen to news, it's important to read newspapers or magazines, but it's also important to put filters. Filters in order to say, yes, this is not totally right. And I have to try to find out what's the way to make an analysis. Last week, I received an email from a young professional here in Washington, and I was very touched. By the end of the email, he has put something like, don't believe everything you hear in the news. That's a very bright statement from a young perspective, saying, well, we just get a lot of information, but what we're doing with that. And I really think that's extremely important.
And I think it's just a constant education, constant trying to keep in front of people what we see, how we experience it. And then from the faith community, again, it's by the scriptures that we live and how that is and what it was and what it's saying today.
We have a question picking up on that Canadian comparison, making the point that in Canada, one route for, say, Syrian refugees to be sponsored into the country is through government sponsorship, but there's also the possibility for individual churches or kind of just private individuals as a kind of committee can sponsor Syrian refugees for, I think it's 13 months they're sponsored for. So the question is, should we support an overhaul in US refugee resettlement to follow that Canadian model where you can go past agencies like yourselves and have communities and churches sponsoring their own refugees? Do you think that would be a good thing? Or, and I'll add my own gloss, do you think actually that's completely unrealistic given the politics of where we are in the US? Tell me what you think of that.
I'm not going to speak for agencies. I'll just speak for local churches that are part of our denomination in Canada that have sponsored Syrian refugee families. And it has been an absolutely wonderful experience for those churches.
We have many parishes across the United States, and especially also here, and even in Washington. And the experiences always has been great, very successful.
I think to your point, David, I think given the security and the political climate that we're in, I see that as highly unlikely. And we've been watching what's happening in Canada with great interest. Some of the Canadians have expressed some concern, and I think we'd want to learn about this as well, as whether or not the level of ongoing care can be sufficiently done, because so many of the families come in with deep trauma, deep skill gaps, and if you can't bring professional skill to bear to that, the reintegration that feels good for the first 4, 5, 6 months can sometimes collapse on you because deep-seated, issues that come out relative to family trauma, what they've been through, have been adequately addressed. So I think we need to be cautious about how we assess the model, but at a practical level, I'd be highly surprised if our current environment allowed for that.
Now we have a question here which touches on precisely that kind of uncertainty about who is a refugee and who is not a refugee. Someone has asked, what about the Central American refugee situation? Are the Central American, particularly I guess the children that we saw in the summer of 2015, I think it was, that they turned up in large numbers, were they refugees? Now some of them are making asylum claims. Are they refugees? And the final part of that question is should the US be helping them in their own home countries? And how is the US? So give us that, because we spent a lot of time talking about Syrians. Talk about the Central American children. Were they legally refugees, and what's the situation there?
I had a trip during summertime to El Salvador, and I was right there gathering with the Episcopal Conference of El Salvador and reviewing the whole process of youngsters coming to the United States. If you really go into the heart of the society in El Salvador, they really don't want their youngsters to come here. They really want that for all of them to stay there. But how we're going to make it happen? By creating opportunities and the investment in programs that might be able to increase the sense of education and self-sustainability for many of them. That would be essential to have the retention that we need to have in the future of these countries. I really think that people in El Salvador, especially speaking with bishops, they really want to create programs that they might be retaining their youth and the future eventually in their own countries.
And Scott, are they legally refugees? Are they people come through your resettlement agency?
They do not come through the U.S. refugee admittance program, so they're not in that program. But I think by many definitions of vulnerability, they would line up in the same kind of vulnerability indexes as refugees. And I think what the bishop is saying is when you can keep families intact and you can invest in communities and create a better community, that is always a better answer. I think the difficulty right now when we look at the broader Middle Eastern refugee situation, the argument's been made it's cheaper to serve them there than to serve them here. Well, that's true if you only take a one-year look. But the average stay in a refugee camp is 17 years. It's not 17 weeks, it's not 17 years. So if you compound the cost for 17 years of caring for someone in that place versus a resettlement, the model flips. And of course, that assumes that a refugee camp is anything like a home community that's being restored. None of us would choose a refugee camp.
Just, I guess, one last question. It's almost inviting you to weigh in on American foreign policy, but is it also the case? You mentioned Jordan and Lebanon in that context, these enormous, very, very long-term refugee populations. Is there an argument that America needs to let at least some in? Because how can America ask countries like Lebanon to let in millions
Exactly
if America won't let in any? Is that an argument you've heard made?
It's an argument that I hear made, but I don't hear it necessarily. I don't hear it from the Congress or from the administration, but I hear it from our grassroots and where we are, that argument that it should be.
Not just in the Middle East, though. American leadership in refugee resettlement has been recognized for decades, and with the U.S. stepping back, the rest of U.S. refugee resettlement around the world has flattened by 60%.
Well, thank you very much, panel, and thank you for your sort of patience with, being willing to grapple with the fact that this is not an easy, happy subject where everyone, is in agreement. But I hope that was useful and practical. And thank you very much for the excellent questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of the questions. There were some excellent questions I didn't have time to get to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.